Hi, so this is the fourth lecture of the course, and today we move from what we saw last time, which are linear classifiers and multilayer perceptrons, to the more generalized models, which are basically what is deep learning. So moving from a sequence of linear and nonlinear processing to an arbitrary graph, and the tools to do so, in particular AutoGrad, which is a way of automatically recording computation to allow automatic differentiation. So in this first part of this fourth lecture, we will also talk about convolution layers. And in the second part, we will see how all this is implemented in PyTorch, what are the tools in PyTorch to use all those things. So what we saw last time was basically processing of that sort, where we had an input, linear operators, affine operators actually of that sort, so multiplication by a matrix, by adding a bias, applying a nonlinearity on the matrix again, bias again, nonlinearity, etc. And actually what I'm going to show in the coming slide is that this can be very easily generalized to an arbitrary directed acyclic graph, which is instead of having this particular graph where the processing are just one after another and the parameters act upon a single processing, you can basically, as long as it's directed, so as long as any value you need depends only on the ones before, that depends only on the one before, and you can go back up to the quantities you know. As long as it's a processing of that sort, you can do everything we have done, which is basically computing the activations or computing the derivatives of quantities with respect to quantities. So we will still use tensorial notations, in particular the Jacobian. So remember we have this bracket notation, derivative of A with respect to B, which is the Jacobian if the vector A, if the value of phi at B, this quantity is a standard Jacobian at B, which is the derivative of each A with respect to each B. So each row corresponds to an A, each column to a B. As always, this notation for simplicity does not specify where it is taken, because all those quantities depend with the B at which they are computed, but it's usually non-ambiguous. It's always in the context of deep learning, it's always for the activation you compute during the forward pass. And we also have, remember, we also have this, and then we also introduce this notation where when a functional depends on two quantities, two vectors, so B and C, I will use this conditioning notation which means that I'm just computing the Jacobian with respect to one of the arguments. So because we need this in particular, because sometimes mappings will depend on both activations and parameters, so we need to have a way of differentiate specific to which we are computing differentiation. Okay, so let's come back to our complicated example of an arbitrary directed acyclic graph. So we have this graph, and we can compute the forward pass simply by moving forward. So we start with the input to the model, which is x, and now we can compute x1, because x1 depends only on x and w1. So now we have these two quantities, we can compute this guy. Then we can compute x2, because we know this guy and we know this guy and we know this guy, so we can compute the value of phi 2. And then we can compute x3, which is the output to our model, because we know everybody. Actually, the proper way would be to go backward again, but you can say I want to compute this quantity, so I need this guy. Since I need this guy, I need this guy. Since I need this guy, I need this guy, and then you see that you can compute everything. But it's still a forward pass. You still go, even though you could implement it in a backward manner to know what we have to compute. The computation itself has to be done in a forward manner. And now we can do the backward pass, because we still have the chain rule with the Jacobian, so which means that the derivative of the loss with respect to the gradient of the loss with respect to x2 is actually the Jacobian of x3 with respect to x2 multiplied by the gradient of the loss with respect to x3. This because x2 influences final loss only through x3. x2 influences what comes after the model only through this quantity. So the derivative of the gradient of the loss with respect to this guy depends only on the gradient of the loss with respect to this guy. And then it's slightly more complicated with x1 because x1 influences both the value of phi2 and phi3. So when you compute the gradient of the loss with respect to x1, you have to take both these two paths into account. So it's basically the Jacobian of x2 with respect to x1 times the gradient of the loss with respect to x2 plus the Jacobian of x3 with respect to x1 times the gradient of the loss with respect to x3, and we get these quantities. And the same for x0. Again, x0 influences the loss only through x1 and x2, so you have the same recipe. So we see that we can compute the gradient of the loss with respect to all the activation involved, this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy. And now what we can do is to compute the derivatives with respect to the parameters. So W1 influences the loss only through phi3 and phi1. So through x3 and x1. So the gradient of the loss with respect to W1 is the Jacobian of x1 with respect to the W1 times the gradient of the loss with respect to x1, and the same for x3. So again, now we have the Jacobian condition over the parameters, specific to the parameters. And the same for W2. So again, it may look a bit complicated in terms of formula, but conceptually it's very simple. It's a chain rule again. You can compute, we compute forward activation, and then we use the chain rule to know how the loss depends on individual quantities simply by propagating the intermediate chain of influence. So now, for this, what do we get that if we have an arbitrary library of tensor operators, phi, for each of those phi, we are able to do this, which is, so those phi depend on parameter and get an input. If we are able to compute the response of phi, if we are able to compute the Jacobian of phi with respect to the input and the Jacobian of phi with respect to its parameter, then we can build an arbitrary directed acyclic graph using those operators at the nodes and compute the response of the resulting mapping and compute the gradient of any loss with respect to the parameters using backpropagation. So we can again go from the final values of the model and go back exactly like we did for the multilayer perceptron. And maybe we should come back to this. It's exactly what happens here. We make the assumption that the loss, the derivative of the loss with respect to x3 is given by the analytical definition of the loss, and then from this we are able to compute the gradient with respect to x2, which is this guy, and then we are able to compute the derivative with respect to x1, which is this guy, and then with respect to x0, which is this guy. So we really do a backward pass. We just go back the opposite direction we had to go for the computing activations. So now writing a large neural network or a large deep model is complex and error prone. It's a good exercise to try, but it's quite difficult. And since we see that we have this very nice formal situation that given the library of operator, we can build arbitrary graphs. In practice, it gives us enough expressivity. So as long as you have this library and this ability to make graph, you're good. So there are plenty of frameworks that provide exactly this. So we already saw all of them, and the one we are going to use is PyTorch, which allows you to define those models in Python, and it's an open source framework. So now one approach to do so, to define those graphs and do the forward and the backward, is to actually define the graph statically. So really to have a syntax to specify exactly what are the nodes and the edges of the graph. This is what historical Torch was doing in Lua. So you had really to define how operations were combined through classes that allows to connect them. It's what TensorFlow allows you to do, and also others, Caffe, Theano, etc. So for instance, in TensorFlow, if now I keep my figure, but now I define what are phi1, phi2, phi3. It's completely arbitrary. It's just to have an example to show. And in TensorFlow, it would look like this. So you have to define a variable to all your parameters. You have to define, and then to define the graph by stating that the input here, I define the input as being random normal. And then you have to define all those edges in a way very similar to computing with tensors. But still, when you are here, what you have defined is a graph for the forward pass and the graph for computing the gradient. But no actual computations occurred. Here you have defined statically the graph, and then you have a specific syntax to say that now you want to execute this graph and to do things with it. We will come back to this in the course given by the Google speaker. We won't say much more here, but what you have to take from this slide, that the first way is to define statically the graph and to have syntaxes to do so in Python, and then to say, now that the graphs are defined, I want to compute the activations and or compute the derivatives. And here we come to AutoGrad, which is a really central piece of PyTorch. In practice, the forward pass is just a computation as usual. So even in the TensorFlow example, the way you would describe a forward pass to somebody, or the way you would like to describe it to your computer when you write your model, is really as a bunch of tensorial operations. You would say, I have an input which is a tensor, and then I do this, and then I do that, and then I do this. It's a very imperative way of describing the computation. There is the graph, of course, there is an underlying graph, as always when you do operations with a computer. But the standard way of doing so in programming is just to describe operations one after another, and the edges correspond to those operations being done, the temporalities, the sequence of operations define how these edges are connected to the quantities. The graph structure is actually needed only for the backward pass. So we have introduced all this graph thing to be able to see that the computation was described as this form, and that we could go back and spot what quantities depend on which one, and in which order the backward should be done. So to summarize all this, the specification of the graph looks a lot like the forward pass, and the operation of the forward pass fully defines those of the backward. So if I tell you I do this, and then I compute this, and then I compute that, and I compute that, then you could take note with a piece of paper of what I'm saying, and then you will be able to compute the derivatives, because we can compute derivatives. So precisely, AutoGrad is about this. So what PyTorch provides is a type called variable, which is actually can be used almost exactly like a tensor. So you can do almost virtually all the operations you can do on a tensor, you can now do it on a variable. But the only difference is that when you do computation with variable, PyTorch is going to record all the computations being done and build the graph of operations transparently to you without you doing any effort for it, which will allow you later to compute the derivative of any quantity with respect to any other, to compute the gradient with respect to any quantity. So this AutoGrad mechanism has two main benefits. The first one is that you have a very simple syntax, because now instead of having to learn the usual NumPy-like tensor operations, and then on top of this to learn an additional set of syntax conventions to define your computational graph, you just use the first. So as soon as you are able to do computation on tensors, you are able to build the graph, because you will simply do your operation as usual. And the second advantage is that it provides you with a greater flexibility, which means that in particular, it may happen that some element of your graph are going to be used in different graphs or in that different moment, or you want to have some sophisticated scheduling of using things like loops, and loops that where the number of loops depend on a meta parameter. You may want to do many complicated stuff to modulate the use of quantity in a very sophisticated manner, and you don't want again to have have the luck to have the specific node element for your graph that allows you to do this. You really do whatever you want in Python. PyTorch will record all the computations, and if at some point you say, now I need the derivative of this with respect to that, this will be possible. So now, in practice, to use AutoGrad, you just have to use Torch AutoGrad variable instead of Torch.tensor. Most of the tensor, so we usually import this guy as variable, so we will call this variable from now on, and as we did for tensor, Torch.tensor is always called just tensor. Most of the tensor operations accept variables, so which means most of the tensor operations have corresponding operations that accept variables. So in practice, a variable is first and foremost a wrapper on a tensor, which has the following field. One is data, which is actually the tensor containing the data itself. But it also has a field called grad, which is useful to accumulate the gradient of this quantity during the computation. We'll come back to this. And it also has a field called requires grad, a Boolean flag that states if you will or not need the gradient with respect to this variable. This will allow PyTorch to do some computation saving. If it sees that a bunch of quantities you will never need the derivatives with respect to them, it will not record everything there because it knows formally that it's going to be useless. So we have another type called parameter, which is simply a variable with this set to true by default, and also which is known by all the PyTorch machinery as being a parameter. So in particular, when you want to save model on disk or when you want to optimize things, it's able, when you find a parameter, PyTorch will know that you want to use it in a certain way in certain situations. A little technical detail that may be surprising. So a variable can only embed a tensor. So when you call, for instance, a loss on a variable, it will return a variable, but since it should be a scalar, now it will return a variable of 1D with a single value. So scalars do not exist as variable, actually, for the moment. And so don't be surprised when you compute the loss of on two variables. What you get is a 1D variable instead of a float value, because float value do not exist. So now the two key functions are torch.autograd.grad that gets mostly there may be other arguments, but the two important ones are outputs and inputs. And this function will return the sum of gradients of the outputs with respect to the specific inputs. This is always a tuple because this guy may take several quantities as input, so it's always the derivative with respect to it's always a tuple. And the second one is torch.autograd.backward variables, which can be called directly by applying backward to a variable, which will accumulate the gradient in all the grad field of the variables which on which the one you are calling it on depends. So let's take okay, this may sound a bit complicated, so let's take a simple example. Here I have the tensor x1, x2, x3, which is equal to 1 to 2, and I compute the norm. So L is the norm of x, which is square root of x squared plus x2 squared plus x3 squared. The loss is this L is equal to 3, because it's 1 square plus 2 square plus 2 square, 1 plus 4 plus 5 is equal to 9, 1 square plus 3. And the derivative of the norm with respect to one of its elements is the element divided by the norm. So now what we can do is to actually import, as always in PyTorch, import tensor, import variable from autograd. So now instead of defining just x being a tensor, I say that x is a variable around this tensor, and I'm stating that I'm going to require the gradient. Now I compute the norm. So this guy is, as I said in the previous slide, is not a float, a scalar, but a variable containing a tensor of size 1 with the value 3, as expected. And now I can just ask autograd, okay, now I want the gradient of L with respect to x, and it returns a variable, which is a tensor of size 3, which is the same dimension as this guy, and which indeed is 1 over 3, 2 over 3, 2 over 3. Okay, so quite simple. The only three elements are now I wrap this tensor into a variable. I indicate that I will need the gradient with respect to this guy. I compute the norm, which give me a variable around the tensor of size 1, of dimension 1 on the single element, single value. And then I can simply ask the gradient of L with respect to x, which is a variable itself, and it's a three-dimensional tensor. Alternatively, I could use variable.backward, which would accumulate the gradient in the variable grad fields. So I do the same, but now I do L.backward, and I get in x.grad the gradient. Why is there this alternative way of computing the gradient? Is that in most of the time, this is when you train large models, or when you train models, it's the one you want to use because you have this systematic existence of a gradient for any parameter of your model. So instead of having to build every time all the machinery of looping through gradients, looping through the parameters, and passing them to the optimizer, etc., this strategy, this convention of having a grad field for every variable allows that all the code written to train models knows that every time there is a parameter, the gradient is right there, and you can use it as it has been set to the accumulated value that makes sense where you are. So now in PyTorch, if we want to re-implement the little example we did in TensorFlow, which is this guy, if you remember, I would simply do like this. So I would say W1 is a parameter around a tensor of dimension 5. W2 is a parameter on a tensor on dimension 5, both filled with normal density. X is a variable, again, size 5 normal, and then I just do my computation. But the difference with TensorFlow is that when I'm here, I have in Q, I actually have the value of the norm. So Q contains the value 3. And when I do this, then it's going to fill all the grad fields of W1 and W2. Not do this guy, because I did not say requires grad equal true, but that's just a choice. So after, when I'm at this, when I'm here, Q has the proper value, is equal to whatever it is. And when I'm here, I have actually filled all the grad fields of W1 and W2. So we can visualize actually what is graph built by PyTorch, by AutoGrad. So the graph is not the graph of the operations that you did, but the graph of the operations needed to compute the gradient with respect to the quantity you are interested in. So for instance, if I go back to the little example where we define a tensor of dimension 3 and compute its norm, if we look, so actually I wrote this little package that you can download. There are, as far as I think, there are other variants of this. Other people did the same. But so what this little package does is, if you give it a variable, it's able to track down the graph which was recorded. So in that case, if you pass it Q is a variable, and it points toward an operator norm backward, which points toward an operator accumulate grad, etc. So I'm just showing this for the sake of completeness of the course. You should not be even aware of this, so you don't need to know this. You need to know this because it's nice to have a little bit larger vision of things, but except if you want to hack into PyTorch, those operators should never appear to you. But I think it's quite interesting because it shows that it's really, in practice, it's quite concrete. What happens is that each variable has a reference toward what it should call to compute the gradient, which itself points toward the next step to do so, which points toward where to accumulate the gradient. So if we go back to our little example, remember we did this. This is what the graph would look like. So I computed a Q at the end, which is the norm, and then it points towards MV backward, which is matrix vector multiplication, which point toward add, which point toward another add, etc. So you can find here quite reasonably what were the operations done, and we see that in the end, indeed, when we will compute this graph, we will end up with accumulating stuff in the parameter. So this really shows you what is now this backward path for this complicated model, for this series of operations. So if I've done this, if this describes my forward path, this is what my backward path looks like. We can have another example. This is a nice one because it shows what happens for a standard model, the standard MLP. So here I define a first layer with the weight matrix is 20 by 10, the bias is 20. And the second layer is 20 by 5 and 5. So this first layer goes for dimension 10 to 20. This one goes from 20 to 5. And then I generate an input vector of dimension 10 with normal noise. And I just compute the value of the hidden layer and use the hyperbolic tangent as nonlinearity. So it's really hidden value equal W1 matrix vector X plus B1, and their output is hyperbolic tangent of W2 matrix vector H plus B2. And in the end, I define an arbitrary target, which is the size, the dimension of the output, dimension 5, with normal noise. And I just say that my loss is means square summed error between the target and y. And now if I look at when I'm here, I can look at the graph, we get the loss. And again, we have the sum with this guy, power backward, which is this guy, sum backward, which is this guy, and there is only 1 euro because I did not ask for the gradient with respect to this guy, so after the sub there was only one branch followed. Then we find the tangent, which is this guy, etc. Add backward, which is this guy, MV backward, which is this guy, etc. etc. And what's interesting that after the first add backward, we find directly B2 because, of course, when we propagate the other way, very quickly B2 matters and then B1. And we are happy because the quantity at the top is the loss we know, and we go back, and at the leaf we get the stuff we want the derivative with respect to. A more sophisticated example to show the power of autograd. Imagine that I define this very strange function. So I have a parameter vector, a parameter tensor 3, 10, 10, and I do this very strange stuff, which is that when I call blah, I'm going to iterate, and for each iteration, I'm going to compute the product of x with one of the W over there. So it's a very weird function. It's just complicated for no reason, just to show that to complicated stuff it works. So blah is basically going to multiply x by a succession of wi and take the hyperbolic tangent every time. And I call it 2 times, and I compute a loss, which is a dot product. It's just to make things complicated on purpose, and we don't care. Even though there is a loop, and there is function call, and there is a bunch of horrible stuff, autograd does not care. Autograd just record all the operational variables on the graph in the background, and so we have the graph. And so you see that the correlation between the variable you get in the end, which is q, and the parameter, which is this guy, is quite complicated, but it's still perfectly defined, and you can compute the gradient of this guy with respect to this guy. Important technical detail: variable.backward accumulates the gradient in the different variables. So if it's not the first time you call it, and you know that you already have stuff in the grad of your parameters and variables of interest, you have to zero them before. We'll come back to this. This accumulating behavior is desirable, in particular, to compute the gradient of a loss summed over several batches of samples, because the gradient, usually the loss is the sum of the individual losses over batches, so the gradient of over the full batch is going to be the sum of the gradients over the individual batches. It may also be because you want to compute the gradient of sum of losses. So again, the gradient of sum of losses is the sum of the gradient of the losses. So you may compute things successively, and in the end you want the sum of the gradient in your variables. So this is a little example to show this accumulating behavior. So here I do the same computation in 2 ways. In the top piece of source, what I do is define a tensor, compute its norm, backward the norm, compute its product with another tensor to the backward, and then thanks to the accumulating behavior, I have the gradient, the sum of the gradient with respect to both. Or what I could do is to compute directly the sum of the two and do the backward, and I get the same value. It's just to show that doing the backward, when you have a sum of a loss which is the sum of terms, doing the backward in one shot or doing the backward successive on the terms give you exactly the same result. Technical detail that may be surprising in some situations, that the autograd graph is not the network structure. So first, it's not the forward graph, but the backward one. It's the graph that computes the gradient of the final quantity with respect to anything. But also, you may be in certain situations where you have complicated models, where some subpart of the model is not always evaluated. So there's discrepancy between the autograd record and the network structure. And finally, something which may be important in certain cases for certain algorithms is that note that the gradient itself is a variable, which means that you can again do the same trick on it, and you can compute higher order derivative. To do so, you have to tell so if you get the gradient through this function, you have to specify that you want it also to have its own graph. So otherwise, because it's quite rare that you need higher order derivatives, virtually all deep learning training is done with first order. By default, PyTorch will not record the autograd graph when it computes the gradient. So you have to tell it, okay, you have to record the graph, in which case you will be able to do the same trick again. So in that case, for instance, X is a tensor, I require the gradient, I compute the sum of the square of its element, and I state that I want the gradient, and I want the graph for the gradient to be computed. So I get the gradient of S1 with respect to X as usual, so it's 2, 4, 6, it makes sense. But now what I can do is to say, now I compute another quantity, S2, which is the first component of G exponential minus the third component of G exponential, and I can do it again. I can compute now the gradient of S2 with respect to X, and it will work. I get the final. And as expected, because this guy, because here each element of the gradient depends only on its corresponding element of the vector, simply because this was a component-wise computation, a sum of the component-wise computation. So here, this guy does depend only on X, on the first component of X, this guy only on the third component of X. So this quantity only depend on the first and third component of X, which appear in the gradient. So it makes sense. In particular, there are sophisticated algorithms where you need, for instance, to regularize the gradient itself. So you need to compute the derivative of the norm of the gradient. So in particular, something which is implicit in what I have described, which is a big deal in some frameworks, but here it's completely natural, is weight sharing. So in our generalized DAG formulation, we have in particular implicitly allowed the same parameter to modulate different operators. So for instance, this guy was both modulating the value of phi1 and the value of phi3, which means that when we had the chain rule to compute the gradient with respect to the value 1, the chain rule had to go through both x3 and x1. This is called weight sharing in the neural network literature. It means that this operator and this operator are sharing the same weights. A very standard case where it's super useful is what was so-called Siamese networks, where you have an input. For instance, it could be a pair of images or a pair of samples, and let's say you want to compute a metric, you want to learn a proper metric, a proper distance between objects. So your model, which is a metric, gets as input a pair, splits the pair into two signals, but now wants to implement exactly the same processing over the two signals. So now when we compute in the end an ad hoc metric, the processing, the features which have been extracted is the same, and it's what we do here, because this network and this network are exactly the same. They are doing exactly the same operations with the same parameters. So it's a very standard processing in the literature, and I think it's quite interesting to see that here when you are given the mechanic of autograd, it's completely it's a non-issue. You can simply do this, and it will do what it's supposed to. So after autograd, we come to another big piece, which are the convolutional layers. So when we deal with real-world signal, they are often of very, very high dimension, so like thousands up to millions of dimensions. So if we deal with them the way we have been dealt with data so far, which is in an unstructured manner, what we had were standard multilayer perceptron, where we just take vectors and multiply them by matrices, this would be completely untractable. So we can take an example to illustrate this. So if we take a network dealing with real-world images, RGB, so a standard size would be 256, 256, because it's RGB of 3 channels. So you get a vector of that size, which is roughly 256, 256 is 65,000, so times 3, you're basically 200,000, which means that if you want to have a matrix, a fully connected layer, that processes this, you need a matrix with 200,000 square number of coefficients, which give you 40 billions coefficients. So in practice, that's completely untractable. The memory footprint would be absurd, so 150 gigabytes. and then it would have so much capacity that it would be able to learn anything. There would be no regularization of any sort. Besides, this requirement is a bit inconsistent with the intuition that we know any signal of large dimension must have some sort of invariance in translation, which means that if a processing makes sense somewhere, if it makes sense to extract, for instance, in a sound, a type of frequency or a type of transition between frequencies, or in an image, if it makes sense to extract some certain type of edges or local features or textures, it should be done everywhere. If it's informative to detect a little piece of your image that there is a giraffe-like fur, it makes sense to spot this everywhere. In some rare cases, that's not true. Again, you can imagine that when you process images, they tend to have this systematic bias that the sky is at the top and the ground is at the bottom. But usually that's a very, very small part of the processing. The vast majority of the processing, what is very intensive is quite invariant in translation. Is quite the signal from a statistical perspective is stationary. And it's basically what convolutional layers are about. They are going to allow you to apply the same linear transformation. So the expansive stuff, we saw that the expansive part of the computation, which is the computation that actually mixes dimensions with each other and which is parameterized by parameters. This processing, the convolution layer will allow you to implement the same everywhere in the signal, following the signal structure. So let's take a very simple example. Let's take a convolution of a vector of dimension 1. So here I have a tensor of dimension 1 and 10 coefficients. And a convolution is defined by a so-called filter or kernel. The canonical name in this context is kernel. Here so it's also an arbitrary example. This guy is of size the big W equal 10. This one is of size small w equal 4. And what we do is that we take the dot product between this guy and this guy. And then we translate and we do it again. So the idea is that if it makes sense to use this linear operator somewhere in the signal, it makes sense to do it everywhere. So it's what we do. We just reapply it everywhere. And we get in the end a signal of size big W minus small w plus 1. In that case, it would be 7, which corresponds to the sequence of dot product between the kernel, which remains identical, and the different positions where you can put it in the signal. Okay. So more formally, in 1D, because this generalizes, let's say that your input is a vector of dimension W, big W, x1 to xw, and the convolutional kernel or filter is of width small w, so it's u1 to uw. Then convolution that I'm going to note that this symbol x convol u is the vector of size big W minus W plus 1 with its ith value is the sum through the filter of the product with the corresponding part in the signal. So it's actually you extract a subvector at location I, it starts at coefficient I in x, you take it off with small w, so it goes from I to I plus small w minus 1, and you really take the dot product. So another example would be, if you take the convolution of this guy with this guy, you get 3 plus 4, because you take 3 times 1 plus 2 times 2 is equal to 3 plus 4. So then you move it over there, it would give you 6 plus 6, and then to put it here, it would give you 9 plus 8. Okay, and you would get 7, 12, 17. A little technical detail that this differs from the usual convolution since the kernel and the signal are both visited in increasing index order. So if you are a signal processing person, you may be a little puzzled by this, because usually you would have a muse somewhere. But for convolution in deep learning, we visit the filter in the same order as the original signal. So what is interesting that even a simple operator like this can implement a differential operator, for instance. So if this is my signal, which is constant, then increase 1 by 1, and then constant again. If I take the convolution with this filter, which is minus 1 plus 1, so it's this computation, I get this response, because if I put this guy, if I take the convolution between this guy and the dot product between this guy and those two guys, it gives me 0, 0, 0. Here it gives me, as soon as the two differs, it gives me 1, 1, 1. And again, if you take minus 4 plus 4, it gives you 0, minus 4 plus 4 gives you 0. So it's very interesting. This allows you to compute slope. You go from this signal to this signal. And also, you can see a convolution operator as a crude template matcher. So if you have an input signal like this, and you say, okay, I want to find in my signal a profile like this somewhere, you get something that looks like a matching score. At every location, you get how much the signal looks like this. So at first, it looks a little bit because you had at least one of the two peaks. And then again, it looks a bit, and suddenly you have your complete hit because you have the two peaks, and then again. Okay, and this makes sense as those two computations are indeed invariant by translation. When if you want to compute the slope, if you have a way of computing the slope, you should use this technique everywhere. And if you have a way of computing a matching between a template and the signal, you should use it everywhere. So this generalizes naturally to a multidimensional input, and the specification can become complicated. And I try to avoid being too messy here, so I will mostly insist on the what's so-called 2D convolutions. But so a 2D convolution takes as input a 3D tensor, and as a filter, which is also 3D. The thing is that we see this as a multi-channel images, and the filter and the input have the same number of channels. In the case where the filter has less channels, there is a notion of 3D convolutions where the filter would move all around. We'll come back to this. But in the so-called 2D convolution, this is an important, very practical thing that you have to understand. A 2D convolution gets as input a 3D tensor where the first index is a channel, then the others are heights and widths, and it produces, if you were convolving by a single filter, it would produce a single tensor of 2 dimensions. But in a standard convolution layer, in a standard convolution processing, you will stack a bunch of those guys to produce a bunch of output. So again, I insist, it may be surprising that we process a 3D tensor and call this a 2D signal or call it a 2D convolution, because we make, in this context, there is usually no structure over the channels. So it's why you don't swipe, you don't move around the channel like you move in space. In certain situations, and we'll come back to this, you may have, for instance, if your tensor, your 3D tensor is a sequence of grayscale images, then it makes sense to move in the across the third index, is a channel index, because now it has a metric meaning. It makes sense when you move a little bit, you move a little bit in time. When the index moves a little bit, it corresponds to really physically moving a little bit in some way, and when you move a lot, it means moving a lot, exactly like in space. But when you are dealing with typically RGB images or more generally multi-channel images, the order over the indexes is meaningless, so we don't swipe the filter across the channels. Okay, so maybe let's illustrate this, because I realize maybe I'm using too many terms that are not clear yet. So in a 2D convolution, I get a tensor like this, which is a multi-channel signal, which has C channels, heights and widths, and I'm going to convolve it with a single filter, a single kernel, which is small h, small w on C channels. And this C is the same as this C, which means that when I put I can swipe the kernel in X and Y, in width and in row and column, but not across channels. So if I take this guy, I put it here, and then it takes the dot product, so the coefficient there times the coefficient there, and then the coefficient there times the coefficient there, etc. I get a single value, which is the dot product of this guy unfolded with this guy unfolded in some way. Okay, then I move, I get a new coefficient, I move, I get a new coefficient, I move, I get a new coefficient, and I do it again and again and again. Okay, so now if I do this, when I convolve this 3D tensor with this 3D tensor, I get a 1D tensor, which is, and here we have the same effect as in 1D, we lose h and small w. So 3D convolves 3D, but with the same number of channels, we get 2D. But now what I can do is to have another filter, and then I get another channel. And it's actually now what is, when we say convolution in deep learning, this is what we have in mind. 2D convolution in deep learning is what we have in mind. You get a 3D tensor, you get a bunch of filters with the same number of channels as the input tensor, and you get a number of a 3D tensor which has basically the same number of rows on columns, you just lose the filter size because the filter has to fit. And the number of channels of the output is the number of filters. It has nothing to do with the number of input channels. You could have, and it happens actually in practice, 3 channels as input. Typically, the first layer of a state of competitive deep models for image recognition would get, as in the first layer, 3 channels for the image, RGB, and then you would have 256 channels, 256 channels, or even more. So this is really arbitrary. It's just the number of filters you put in there. Okay. Important point, which I hope is already clear, that the convolution preserves the signal support structure, which is, if you get a 1D signal, you do a 1D convolution, you get a 1D signal. If you get a 2D signal, you do a 2D convolution, you get a 2D signal. And the neighborhood is maintained, which is parts which are close nearby in the original signal are going to influence part nearby in the resulting output. And again, I come back to a remark I already did a few minutes ago. There is a notion of 3D convolution where you actually move the filter both across rows, columns, and now also across channels. But this makes sense only if it makes sense if there is a physical meaning for the indexing along the channel. If the channel means time, or it can mean something else. So for instance, if it's even in the RGB case, imagine that now you have a multispectral image where actually the channel makes sense because it's a frequency at which you are capturing the signal. It may make sense to actually swipe across frequencies, but it's often not the case. So the most standard operator is 2D convolution, where you have the filter has as many channels as the input. A bit of vocabulary now. One of the map corresponding to one of the filter is called an activation map. And when you take a value in one of the output map, a single value, we call the receptive field the area of the input signal that influence it. So it's basically a part of the input signal which has the same size as the filter. And in the context of convolution networks, a standard linear layer is called a fully connected layer because every input influences every output. Okay. So another family of processings which are very useful and very standard are pooling. So in many cases, you take a high dimension signal and you have eventually to get a small signal, for instance, a few scores to make a decision. In that case, it means that somewhere in this processing, you are reducing the dimension. So convolution already reduces a little bit the dimension, but in an iterative manner, not in a geometric way. You just lose a little bit at the border due to the filter size. But if you want to have a more drastic reduction, so for instance to divide by a factor, you may use pooling. So as for convolution, it makes sense to reduce the signal size in a way that preserves structure. So typically, again, if you interpret your signal as an image, you would like to reduce the image size to rescale it, so that now you are reasoning at a lower scale. And so this operation is called pooling, which means that you are going to take groups of values to extract a quantity which is probably more meaningful than any of them. So you would like to put them in common to get a single value which has important information content. So the most standard pooling is max pooling, which computes the max values over non-overlapping blocks. So if we take an example in 1D, so I have an input signal of 1 dimension on 10 indexes, 10 coefficients. And let's say I'm doing my max pooling over a kernel of size 2. So we reuse the same vocabulary, the same word of kernel. So if my kernel is of size 2, I take the max of those two guys, I get this guy, the max of those two guys, I get this guy, the max of those two guys, I get this guy, etc. So basically, I divide the size of my signal by 2. And another pooling is the average pooling, which computes average values per block instead of max values. And it can be seen actually as a convolution because it's a convolution by a filter which is constant. So now max pooling or pooling over a 3D tensor. So here, channels are processed separately, so it's not like a convolution. We are really maintaining the number of channels. And what we do is simply that we take the max over a little block and we do it again. The fact that we keep the channels separated is basically the the reverse argument is that, or the same argument that relates to reverse conclusion. Since the channels have nothing to do with one another in terms of their location in space, it would in the index along the channel axis, it would make no sense to take the max of them all together. Sometimes we can, but usually you don't do this. So you take the max, and in the end, you compute a tensor which has the same number of channels, but now the height and width has been divided by the size of your filter. Pooling provides invariance to any permutation inside one of the cell, of course, because the max is invariant by permutation. And in practice, it provides a pseudo-invariance to deformation that resulted to local translation. So for instance, if this is a 1D signal and I take the max pooling over blocks of size 3, if I do a little translation, so I picked carefully my translation, I'm cheating a little bit here because I picked it so that you never have a big one moving and changing a block. But it gives the feeling that, it gives the understanding that it's actually what happens. If you have a little deformation locally, your response does not change. And the same if you have a permutation inside each cell. So this is, again, when you do analysis of why deep network, deep models do what they are supposed to do, it's always a bit complicated, but this is probably one of the elements. By putting max pooling in your model, you let the learning have a way of discarding information it does not need and keeping the information which is required. So now it will probably organize the information so that through the pooling, important information will be kept and the useless information will be discarded. Okay, so this is the end of the first part. And in the second part, we'll see how all this is actually done in PyTorch. So what are the modules to do convolutions and pooling and build finally a complete model.